come with us on a musical journey through some of the most magnificent places on earth. Great towns and cities of Europe, steeped in history and beauty, and resounding with the stories and music of the world's great composers. Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, Grieg, Vivaldi, Tchaikovsky. Just some of the greats in our classical destinations.
Hello, I'm Simon Callow. Welcome to another musical journey to some of the most beautiful cities in Europe as we explore the lives of the famous composers. By looking at the places where the great composers lived, loved, and worked, we can gain an insight into what makes their music what it is.
From Helsinki, the flight to St. Petersburg takes less than 1 hour, but it's like stepping back in time.
Welcome to Classical Destinations. I'm Matt Wills, and this is St. Petersburg.
This city is absolutely one of the most beautiful cities in the world. This whole place is like one great museum, and you could spend weeks here and not see all of it.
St. Petersburg is the cultural treasure trove of Russia. In its relatively short history, it's produced a wealth of ballet, theatre and opera companies, singers, writers, dancers, orchestras. There are over 500 palaces here.
And the music, Rimsky-Korsakov, Borodin, Mussorgsky, Glinka, and of course Tchaikovsky are just some of the greats that this city has to offer.
St. Petersburg was the capital of Russia from the early 1700s until 1918. Situated in the delta of the Neva River at the eastern end of the Gulf of Finland, it is known even now by many Russians as the northern capital. Peter and Paul Fortress is a good place to start because it was the first official building in St. Petersburg. Peter the Great of Russia wanted a capital and seaport near the rest of Europe. So when he reclaimed the lands along the Neva River from Sweden, he decided in 1703 to build a garrison on an island in the river as protection from attack. Ironically, the Swedes were defeated before the fort was even completed. For that reason, part of it became a high-security political jail. It has housed the likes of Dostoevsky, Gorky, Trotsky, and Lenin's older brother Alexander. Parts of the jail are now open to the public.
In the middle of the fortress stands the Peter and Paul Cathedral. It's still the tallest building in St. Petersburg at over 122 metres. The weather vane on top is a golden angel holding a cross, and it's become a symbol for the city.
The cathedral is the burial place of all the Russian emperors and empresses, from Peter the Great right through to Nicholas II, the last Tsar, whose remains were found only a few years ago. Now this little cutout in the marble here is where the DNA sample was taken to see if Nicholas's remains were of genuine royal lineage. Indeed, the remains were of Nicholas, and he and his family and faithful servants were laid to rest here on the 17th of July 1998, the 80th anniversary of their murder.
St. Petersburg is a relatively young city, with a short but turbulent 300 years of history. This wooden cabin was the first living quarters built in the newly founded city of St. Petersburg, constructed for Tsar Peter himself. In fact, he lived here off and on for about 5 years. When he left, he ordered that another building be constructed to encase the cottage and preserve it. Peter wanted all of the houses in his new city to be built of stone or bricks, but with none available at the time, he had the walls painted to make the house look as if it was made of bricks.
Almost everything about the way Peter built the city was grand. The palaces and boulevards are made to be viewed from a distance, and if you have time and the temperature is above zero, on foot is a great way to go.
Long before Peter the Great came along, in the year 1240 in fact, a Russian by the name of Alexander of Novgorod was supposed to have defeated the Swedes on this very spot and earned for himself the title Nevsky, which means of the Neva. Now, the actual battle took place about 20 kilometers away, but Peter founded this monastery behind me in the year 1710 in honor of Alexander's victory.
Peter esteemed the monastery, as it trained priests of high rank for the Orthodox Church. For this reason it was called Lavra, a title reserved for such prestigious institutions.
Inside the Lavra is a very special cemetery called the Necropolis of Masters of Arts, and this area in particular contains some of the greats of Russian music. Rimsky-Korsakov, Mussorgsky, Borodin, and perhaps the greatest of all, Tchaikovsky.
This grave belongs to a man not all that well known outside of Russia, but whose influence on those who followed was huge.
Mikhail Glinka is the composer who made Russian classical music sound, well, Russian. Born into a wealthy merchant family in 1804, he was able to spend much of his youth immersed in Western classical music, while having the sounds and folk music of his own country swimming around in his head. Mix all this together, add a Russian text and an 1836 premiere in a country with a rapidly increasing middle-class intelligentsia, and you get Glinka's opera A Life for the Tsar, which influenced the generation of composers who came after him and really kick-started the nationalist movement in Russian music. Tchaikovsky's first compositions are said to have borrowed heavily from Glinka.
30 kilometers south of St. Petersburg is the Grand Palace of Pavlovsk, built for Tsar Paul I as his summer residence.
And it's something to behold.
The palace's second floor is a vast display of a Russian interior of the 19th century. But the special attraction inside is the suite of rooms which belonged to the wife of Tsar Paul I, Maria Feodorovna. They contain many of her personal effects and other original items of the 18th century. The palace is open daily and offers a valuable insight into the life of the Tsars. Occupied and ransacked by the Germans during the siege of Leningrad in the Second World War, it has been impressively restored.
In 1838, the first Russian railway was built between St. Petersburg and Pavlovsk. It ran right through here and into a section of the park called the Great Star. In order to attract St. Petersburg society, great dinner parties and concerts were held here on a regular basis.
They became famous when Johann Strauss Jr. appeared as guest conductor in 1856 for a series of what became annual performances. The Waltz King brought the charm of popular Viennese music into St. Petersburg cultural life and helped to integrate Russia into the cultural life of the West.
Strauss was every bit as popular here as he was in Vienna. He became the idol not only of Russian aristocrats, but also their wives. More than once he found himself in difficulty trying to escape jealous husbands or young girls he'd fancied.
In the end, Strauss handed his baton over to Michael Glinka to continue the tradition, and concerts were held subsequently for more than 100 years. There are plenty of composers for whom composing is really just something to be done on the side. It's a bit like acting, really. Many in our hallowed profession still have to keep the day job. Alexander Borodin is a famous musical example. His day job was rather impressive. He was the professor of chemistry at the St. Petersburg Medical Academy from the 1860s and a world expert on things like the analogy of arsenical with phosphoric acid. After a busy day with his students and the test tubes, he'd come home, retire to the study, and tinker with an opera called Prince Igor, or perhaps the odd symphony or string quartet. He took his time over it all, which is really rather a shame because he dropped dead while overexerting himself at a fancy dress ball in 1887 when he was just 53. His musical oeuvre, therefore, is rather small, but crammed with so many wonderful tunes that some decades later, a couple of enterprising Broadway writers decided to weave them into the musical called Kismet. But the originals are infinitely more exotic, more sensuous, and much, much more dangerous, as here in the dances of the Polovtsian warriors and their maidens from Prince Igor.
Art Square is a perfect example of the extensive planning which went into the making of St. Petersburg. It was designed by Italian-born Carlo Rossi, who spent most of his working life in Russia.
Accordingly, there's a southern classical elegance in its proportions and the style of its building facades. The most notable is the Mikhailovsky Palace, which today houses the Russian Museum and the second largest collection of art in the country. Also on Art Square, the Mali, or Small Theatre, was built in 1833. It has often been the venue for the premieres of modern Russian ballets and operas, leaving the productions of classic repertoire on a larger scale to its bigger companion in town, the Mariinsky Theatre. The Mali is also called the Mussorgsky Theatre.
Now, Mussorgsky was a pretty interesting man too. He had a real job like so many of these early Russian composers. Well, at least to begin with.
Born in 1839, Mussorgsky initially pursued a career in the army before music took over. In 1857, he met and studied with Balakirev and became one of the group of composers known as the Mighty Handful, resigning from the army. But in 1868, he began work on his opera Boris Godunov, which was a great success at its premiere in 1874. Powerful, stirring, it is, for many, the greatest Russian opera.
Mussorgsky's drinking was a problem. It sapped his ability for concentrated work. The last few years of his life creatively were very patchy. In 1881, he suffered an alcoholic seizure in the street and was taken to hospital, where he died a month later, a week after his 42nd birthday.
The statue of Nicholas I dominates the center of St. Isaac's Square. The first houses were built here in the 1760s. The oldest building is the Myatlev's mansion, where Alexander Pushkin visited his friend, fellow poet Ivan Myatlev. In the 1840s, the Ministry of State Property was begun, as was the beautiful Mariinsky Palace, a wedding gift from Nicholas I to his daughter, the Grand Duchess Maria. Nowadays, the building houses the St. Petersburg Legislative Assembly.
But the main attraction of the square is the magnificent St. Isaac's Cathedral. Commenced in 1818, it took 40 years to complete and is one of the greatest architectural constructions of its time, over 100 meters high and wide.
Another point of interest is this building.
The Hotel Astoria was built in 1912 and since then has been the hotel of choice for visiting artists and dignitaries. The guest list is quite impressive. Maxim Gorky, Fedor Shelyapin, Isadora Duncan, Anna Pavlova, not to mention members of the Royal Romanov and Fabergé families.
And the view of St. Isaac Square is just perfect.
This is the Astoria's Tchaikovsky Suite, where prime ministers, presidents and other heads of state stay when they're visiting St. Petersburg.
This suite is really beautiful. Just take a look around. Thank you.
The Astoria is pretty central to most of the sites around St. Petersburg, but there's one creative icon just 10 minutes up the road.
And I think I know exactly what you're talking about.
Come on.
The Mariinsky Theatre was named in honor of Tsar Alexander II's wife, Maria. It was built in 1860 as an opera house, but its reputation rests mainly on the ballet performed here, especially as it is home to that most famous of ballet companies, the Kirov, known for a while as the Mariinsky. The height of its fame was just after the turn of the last century, when Václav Nijinsky and Anna Pavlova were the draw cards. But of course, no less famous in our time were Rudolf Nureyev, Natalia Makarova and Mikhail Baryshnikov, who were all stars of the Mariinsky before defecting to the West.
Here in the main square of St. Petersburg, Palace Square, you can see some great examples of how different architectural styles are being combined to stunning effect. Over here behind me on the northern side is the magnificent Baroque Winter Palace, built in 1762.
In the opposite direction, on the southern side, is the classical yellow and white building of the former Imperial Army General Staff, built by Carlo Rossi between 1819 and 1829. The triumphal arch, also a classical design, leads through to Nevsky Prospect, the main boulevard of St. Petersburg. To the west, the square borders the Admiralty with its gardens. In the center is the imposing Alexander Column. The column itself is a single piece of red granite weighing over 600 tons. Quite an amazing feat to hoist that up in 1834. Incidentally, the angel's face is said to have been modeled on the face of Tsar Alexander I. Russia's first conservatory was opened in St. Petersburg in 1862 under the direction of pianist, composer and conductor Anton Rubinstein.
In 1871, this great man behind me, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, joined the staff as professor and remained there for 20 years. But before that, he attended the Naval Academy in St. Petersburg. He wrote his first symphony while on a 3-year naval cruise. When he joined the staff here, Nikolai realized that he knew almost no music theory, despite the fact that he'd already completed 2 symphonies and numerous other works. So he taught himself in secret and became one of the world's great music theorists, particularly in music harmony. Several of Rimsky-Korsakov's students achieved musical greatness, including Sergei Prokofiev and Igor Stravinsky, and his influence has been quite profound.
In 1861, he met the composer Balakirev, and through him joined young composers Kui, Mussorgsky and Borodin in a group that became known as the Five, the Mighty Handful. Partly because of the influence of Glinka, the group stressed their national heritage through their music.
This was the final residence of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, and he lived here for 15 years. It's now a museum with a fabulous assortment of memorabilia that gives you a bit of an insight into the life of the man.
The gamble the St. Petersburg Conservatory took in appointing a raw 27-year-old to the professorship of composition in 1871 paid off. Rimsky-Korsakov turned out to be a very good teacher. Among his students was Stravinsky, who acquired much of his master of the orchestra from his great teacher. You hear this best in Rimsky's symphonic suite Scheherazade, based on stories from the Arabian Nights as told by Madame Scheherazade herself. Her new husband, the Sultan Harun al-Rashid, has executed all his former wives on their wedding night. To avoid their fate, she tells him cliff-hanging tales throughout the night. In the score, Rimsky shows both Harun al-Rashid's implacable character and Scheherazade's seductive skills. He is charmed. She lives. Rimsky's sea voyages as a sailor took him to the Mediterranean, Rio, New York, and most exotic of all, Gravesend in Britain. I don't think he made it to Arabia, so Scheherazade must be a fantasy sound world of the ancient Middle East. It's a most glamorous sound, too. Something entirely new in the music of the late 19th century, one that obviously meant a few years in Hollywood, 50 years later. All those studio pictures about Aladdin and flying carpets, they sound suspiciously like Rimsky-Korsakov. His carpets, though, are of a much finer weave. Oh, yes, he also wrote that piece about a bumblebee. In 1944, on the centenary of his birth, the conservatory was renamed the Rimsky-Korsakov State Conservatory in his honor.
You know, I really admire Rimsky-Korsakov, the way he schooled himself so thoroughly in music and was able to practice on the work of his friends.
And did you know that while he was working on Borodin's Prince Igor, he was actually writing some of his own most colourful works, like my favourite, Scheherazade.
Yeah, an amazing composer. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this little snapshot of St. Petersburg. As you can see, it's a city rich in culture and the arts.
We'll be going back to St. Petersburg, the Venice of the North, later in the series. But for our next program, we go to Venice itself, home of the great Baroque composer, Antonio Vivaldi, author of that very famous cycle of violin concertos, I Quattro Stagioni, the Four Seasons. Venice, our next classical destination. So, it's goodbye from Matt and from Nikki and from me, Simon Callow. See you then.